In ancient Rome, the act of running away was more than desperation. It was a direct insult to the very structure of the empire. Every enslaved person was considered a fragment of Rome's vast machinery, and to escape was to declare that the system could be resisted. For enslaved women in particular, the decision to flee was an act of unimaginable courage, but it came with a price branding humiliation, torture, and death. Rome treated escape not as a private crime, but as a public betrayal, one that required spectacle. Imagine the streets of Rome in the 1st century CE. Marble temples glimmer in the sun, senators argue in the forum, and merchants hawk spices along the Tiber. Yet beneath this grandeur lies a constant murmur of fear. Enslaved women plotting flight, dreaming of freedom, knowing that a single step outside the household could mean capture. The empire built its wealth on the backs of slaves. War captives, abandoned children debtors, and women were doubly vulnerable. They worked in kitchens, laundries, and fields, but also bore the burden of sexual exploitation. When one tried to flee Rome, made sure everyone saw the punishment. The branding iron was perhaps the most common mark of Rome's vengeance. Heated until it glowed, it was pressed against the forehead, leaving an indelible scar of letters like FVG Fugitiva. No veil or cloak could cover it. No lie could erase it. A woman branded was forever marked as damaged property, her body turned into a billboard of shame. To Roman citizens, walking past the scar was both a warning and a reassurance. Rome was in control, even over bodies that tried to resist. For the woman, it was a lifelong disfigurement that stripped away dignity. In a society obsessed with beauty, modesty, and the female face, the mark annihilated her social identity. But branding was only the beginning. Public punishments transformed enslaved women into tools of terror. Being chained at the household gate, ad ianuam, was another method, one that blurred the line between person and architecture. Passers-by would see her bound with iron shackles, her body becoming part of the house itself, an unwilling ornament of obedience. Rain, cold hunger, and the mocking stares of neighbors compounded the punishment. The threshold of the Roman domus was sacred, a space where family honor was displayed. To be fastened there was to be turned into a living lesson, a symbol of dishonor made permanent by exposure. Flight was considered theft. A woman carried with her not only her body, but her labor, her potential offspring, her capacity to be exploited. Masters demanded retribution, and Roman law granted it freely. The whip was an omnipresent tool. Flagrum whips with bone or lead weights tore flesh and muscle. There was no regulation on lashes, no oversight, no mercy. Sometimes whipping was private, to reassert authority within the walls of the home. Sometimes it was public. The woman displayed bleeding and broken, so others would think twice before attempting freedom. For repeat offenders, punishments escalated to horrifying extremes. Some women were thrown into the arena under the sentence of damnatio ad bestias. They were not trained gladiators, but victims stripped and chained left to face lions or bears before a roaring crowd. Others were burned alive or forced to play mythological roles in grotesque theatrical executions. Roman citizens watched, cheered, and consumed their deaths as entertainment. These punishments made flight a gamble. With life itself, escape could mean freedom for a day, but if caught, the cost was humiliation or execution staged for thousands. The most feared punishment, however, was deportation to the mines. Condemnation to the mind's damnatio in metallum was essentially a death sentence in slow motion. Women hauled stones, crushed ore, and worked in toxic shafts without air or light. Overseers beat them if they faltered. Pregnant women gave birth in darkness, their infants doomed to die. Unlike public punishments which broadcasted Rome's power, the mines erased fugitives from the city's sight entirely. Their suffering was unseen, but absolute. These punishments reveal the essence of Roman slavery. Control had to be absolute, and resistance had to be crushed in ways that were not only effective, but symbolic. Women who fled weren't punished just to deter others. They were transformed into living warnings. A branded forehead, a chained body, a scar from the whip, all became permanent signs carved into human flesh. The cruelty was systemic, designed to remind both slaves and free citizens that freedom for some rested on bondage for many. Yet, the very existence of these punishments tells us something else. Enslaved women continued to resist. They risked capture, mutilation, even death, because the possibility of freedom outweighed the certainty of servitude. Rome could brand, chain, scourge, and kill, but it could never fully erase the desire to escape. That tension, the empire's iron grip against the human will to resist, defined the hidden war of slavery in ancient Rome. This is the cost of flight. The empire of law, spectacle, and blood, reminding the world that its order was built on control. But every scar, every brand, every body in the arena was also testimony that Rome was never entirely secure. Beneath its triumphal arches and marble temples, the quiet footsteps of fugitives haunted the empire, whispering a truth that Rome feared most. No system of domination is unbreakable. In Rome, to run was to commit a crime against the entire order of things. To attempt escape was to deny not only the authority of a master, but the legitimacy of Roman hierarchy itself. That defiance demanded a punishment as permanent as the act was bold. Branding the searing of skin with iron became the empire's chosen language of shame. The ritual was brutal in its simplicity. A slave caught after flight was dragged before an audience. Sometimes household members, sometimes the larger community, and held down. The iron, heated until it glowed red, was pressed against the forehead. The letters FVG, short for fugitiva, runaway, burned into the flesh. There was no discretion, no possibility of hiding what had been done. Rome made certain that the mark of defiance was transfigured into a permanent scar of dishonor. Some brands were longer phrases mocking in their declaration, "Teneo te fugitive, I hold you fugitive." Others were crude symbols, the very minimalism reinforcing that the slave was now nothing but a message. The forehead was chosen deliberately. It was the most visible part of the body, the part most intimately connected with identity, gaze, and dignity. Romans placed immense cultural weight on the face. To be disfigured, there was not simply to be scarred, but to be rewritten. In a society where honor and modesty were everything. The burn transformed a woman into a living proclamation of defeat. She could not mingle unnoticed among freeborn citizens, could not hope to disguise her status. Even her shadow carried the shame, the brand turning her body into an eternal warning. But the pain was more than physical. Branding cut deeper than flesh. It cut into memory. Every time a branded woman caught her reflection in polished bronze or still water, the scar stared back, reminding her of the moment of fire. It silenced her future. closed doors she might have dreamed of opening. Beauty, so often the currency of survival for enslaved women in elite households, was stolen in an instant. Where a pleasing appearance might once have earned lighter tasks or fleeting kindness, the scar now marked her as damage-corrupted property. The ceremony of branding was often public because its purpose was not merely discipline, but theatre. The iron hissed, the victim cried out. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. These were not incidental details. They were the performance of Roman authority. Other enslaved people watched, absorbing the message flight would be answered not with freedom, but with pain made permanent. The branded forehead became a silent overseer in every gathering of slaves, a scar that spoke louder than words. Writers of the period treated this cruelty with chilling casualness. Plotters joked of slaves whose branded faces made them advertisements of their own failure. Juvenal used the branded forehead as shorthand for disgrace. To their audiences, these references needed no explanation. Everyone knew what FVG meant. Everyone knew what had been done to earn it. The humor reveals not indifference, but normalization. Cruelty was so embedded in the Roman imagination that even its most grotesque forms could be twisted into punchlines. Archaeological traces confirm the practice's reach. Iron brands have been uncovered in Pompeii and Herculaneum, their shapes and inscriptions consistent with literary accounts. Inscriptions mention fugitivarii, professional slave catchers whose livelihood depended on returning escapees for punishment. To them, the brand was efficiency proof that they had delivered what was owed. To the enslaved, it was erasure the face they once recognized as their own, overwritten by Rome's decree. And yet the brand carried a paradox. It was meant to humiliate, but it also testified to resistance. Every woman marked with FVG had once believed she might escape, had once defied the boundaries Rome drew around her. The scar was intended as a tombstone for freedom, but it could also whisper, here was someone who tried. The Romans sought to weaponize shame, but in doing so, they preserved the memory of rebellion on the body itself. For enslaved women, the wound was doubled by gender. Female modesty in Rome was tied to appearance, to the careful maintenance of dignity before the public gaze. Branding did not only punish rebellion, it annihilated femininity as the Romans defined it. To carry a scarred forehead was to be cast out of womanhood itself, placed beyond the pale of honor. The burn was not just heat. It was exile from beauty, from dignity, from the possibility of social redemption. Imagine her afterward forced back into daily tasks, the wound raw and visible. Every order barked at her reinforced the brand. Every glance from fellow slaves reminded her she was now a lesson more than a person. Rome did not need chains to hold her anymore. The iron had already fused her into its architecture of control. But scars tell stories. And while Rome intended the brand to speak only of subjugation, history allows us to hear another voice. The woman who bore FVG was not merely a runaway caught. She was a human being who once dared to seek liberty. The brand of shame was meant to silence, but across centuries, it forces us to listen, to see the cost Rome exacted for the audacity of hope. If branding marked the forehead as a billboard of shame, chaining women at the household entrance ad ianuam turned the body itself into living architecture. In ancient Rome, the domus was more than a home. It was a theatre of power where every doorway, every mosaic, every column announced the authority of the paterfamilias. To to fasten a runaway woman to that threshold was to make her part of the scenery, a warning nailed into the very facade of domestic life. The punishment unfolded with grim precision. The woman recaptured and already humiliated was led to the front gate. She might be stripped to her undergarments or left with her clothing torn to ensure visibility. Iron shackles bit into her wrists or ankles, the chains hammered into a column or beam of the entrance. There she remained, exposed to wind rain and the relentless Roman sun. Passers-by could not miss her. Guests arriving for dinner stepped past her. Neighbors knew her name and her crime before entering. She was not hidden in the back room or the cellar. She became the household's living threshold, a barrier between defiance and order. The symbolism was deliberate. The Roman doorway, or Ianua, was sacred, watched over by the god Janus, guardian of beginnings and endings. To be chained there was to desecrate the liminal space, to turn the sacred threshold into a stage of punishment. For the enslaved community within the household, the message was clear. The master controlled not only the rooms and the people inside, but the very passage between private and public. No one crossed without being reminded of what rebellion meant. The humiliation was layered. Romans associated female virtue with modesty, with the careful concealment of the body from public gaze. To be displayed shackled and helpless was to strip away not only dignity, but the essence of womanhood as Romans defined it. Exposure became part of the cruelty. Comic playwrights like Plautus and Terence made light of chained slaves at the gate, treating the spectacle as a familiar joke, even a set piece in comedic plots. Audiences laughed because they recognized the image. They had seen it in their neighborhoods, in their own households. What satire mocked was already ordinary life. Archaeological traces confirm the practice. Excavations in Pompeii and Ostia have revealed iron rings fixed into masonry near entrances too low for decorative purpose, but perfect for securing shackles. Some show signs of wear from repeated strain metal against metal. These mute objects confirm what the literature normalizes, that human beings were turned into fixtures displayed like lamps or door guardians. Except these guardians were made to suffer. The punishment could last hours or days. Food might be withheld, water rationed. The chained woman was left vulnerable to ridicule, from passers-by to insults hurled by freeborn children, even to the casual violence of strangers emboldened by her helplessness. To stand at the threshold was to be stripped of privacy, of rest, of self. She was a body-turned lesson, a tool of pedagogy by pain. The psychological weight was immense. Every knock at the door, every visitor passing by reinforced her status as spectacle. She was forced to embody failure to perform obedience in chains while enduring scorn. For others in bondage within the house, the sight was unforgettable. It told them that flight would not lead to liberty, but to a punishment worse than labor being made an object in the architecture of control. And yet within the cruelty lies the clarity of Rome's logic. The household was a microcosm of the state, the paterfamilias a mirror of the magistrate. To chain a woman at the gate was to project discipline outward, to declare mastery to the street, the neighbors, the city. Rome's order depended on the constant rehearsal of power in visible public forms. The runaway slave became a prop in that endless performance. The comedy that referenced it, the archaeology that proves it, the scars of those who endured it all point to a society where punishment was not merely inflicted, but displayed, where control was not satisfied with silence, but demanded spectacle. The chained woman at the threshold stood as Rome's paradox, simultaneously invisible as a person and hypervisible as a warning. The gate, a place meant to welcome, became instead a shrine of fear. And in that transformation we see the Roman genius for cruelty, not hidden in shadows, but showcased in daylight, built into the very bricks of domestis. Step past the chained woman at the gate, and the lesson did not end. Within the Roman household, punishment was not only a tool of correction, but a form of theatre staged daily for the enslaved community. The domus, with its atrium peristyle and painted walls, was not simply a home of luxury, it was a fortress of discipline. Every corridor whispered of surveillance. Every chamber could become a stage of fear. For enslaved women who dared to flee their bodies could be displayed as permanent reminders of what resistance cost. The architecture itself reinforced control. The Roman house was built to be open guests, entered directly into the atrium, with the master's household gods looking down. Light from the compluvium illuminated not only the mosaics, but also the people moving within. There was no privacy for slaves. Punishments were enacted in these bright spaces where their suffering could be seen by peers, by guests, and by family. When an enslaved woman was flogged or chained within the atrium, the act was not hidden. It was a demonstration. The domus turned into a courtroom without laws, and a stage without applause. Fear was cultivated deliberately. Roman writers like Seneca and Pliny described how fear, not kindness, kept slaves obedient. Fear made them predictable, so punishments were timed for maximum impact. A woman caught fleeing might not be punished in the shadows of her capture, but paraded back into the household stripped and bound. Her punishment delayed until every other enslaved person had been summoned to witness. The moment was orchestrated like ritual, the master speaking of loyalty, the overseer wielding the whip, the woman's body, the central text of the performance. This theatre of cruelty was especially brutal for women. Rome's culture of modesty made exposure doubly humiliating. To be beaten with breasts bared, to have garments torn in front of fellow slaves and freeborn spectators, was to rob not only dignity, but identity. Enslaved men were beaten to demonstrate subordination. Enslaved women were beaten to demonstrate both subordination and dishonor. Their punishment was designed to corrode every layer of self. Yet for all its brutality, this spectacle was considered normal. Household manuals, legal digests, even comic plays treat whipping and chaining as everyday management techniques. Plautus joked of slaves who feared the whip more than the gods, and his audience laughed because it was true. Archaeological remains, iron collars inscribed with words like "Teneo te fugitivus," I hold you fugitive, show how even objects were crafted to extend the spectacle of punishment into daily life. A collar was not just a restraint. It was a signboard declaring the wearer's failed escape to everyone she passed. The domus, then, was not just a site of domestic order, but a miniature prison. Enslaved women cooked, cleaned, dressed their mistresses, sang lullabies to children, yet lived every hour under the shadow of potential display. Any misstep could turn their body into warning. The walls that displayed frescoes of myth and gods could just as easily display human suffering etched not in paint, but in blood and scars. Fear was contagious. It was meant to be. The woman punished was not the only target. The true audience was the dozens of enslaved eyes forced to watch. To see one's sister in chains at the entrance, to hear a companion scream under the lash in the atrium, was to absorb a message. Obedience was survival. Defiance was annihilation. Rome did not need every slave to run to the mines or the arena. It needed only a few examples vividly displayed to discipline the many. But this discipline was not perfect. For some enslaved women, the spectacle did not kill the desire for freedom. It stoked it. To endure humiliation and still dream of escape was an act of resistance. Whispers circulated in kitchens, in storerooms, in the silent glances exchanged over amphorae of wine. Memory became rebellion. Even as the domus tried to terrify it, also recorded its own crimes in the minds of those who bore witness. The Roman house was a paradox. Outwardly, a place of refinement, art, and familial devotion; inwardly, a stage where pain was rehearsed daily to keep the machinery of slavery running. The laughter of children and the crack of the whip echoed together in the same spaces, and every threshold, every atrium, every peristyle bore witness to the cruel fact for enslaved women: the domus was not a sanctuary of family, but a theatre of fear. If the household was a theatre of fear, the arena was its public cathedral. Here, punishment ascended from private discipline to a spectacle for the masses. For enslaved women who fled repeatedly or defied their masters in ways deemed intolerable, the penalty was not just pain, but annihilation staged for the roar of a crowd. This was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, one of the Roman Empire's most chilling institutions, where law and entertainment fused into horror. To a Roman audience filing into the Colosseum or a provincial amphitheatre, these women were not individuals, but props. Their crime, flight, defiance, rebellion was reimagined as treason against the social order itself. And treason deserved a death that was not swift, but instructive. The condemned were stripped of clothing, dignity, and name. They were reduced to the status of mythic victims, woven into elaborate stagings of stories. Rome told itself about the fragility of order and the price of transgression. Animals were central to this theatre. Lions imported from Africa, bears from the mountains, leopards from distant provinces. Each was starved before release, their hunger sharpened to ensure maximum violence. Women were chained or staked to the ground, sometimes dressed in costumes to mimic tragic heroines of legend. One might be forced to play the role of Andromeda bound and left for a beast in a grotesque parody of myth. Another might be cast as Pasiphae, or Dirce, victims of God's cruel games. Her suffering turned into performance for an audience, who laughed, gasped, and applauded. Fire was another instrument of spectacle. Sources describe women being burned alive, their bodies consumed as incense, to sate the gods of order. Sometimes they were executed in pairs or groups, forced to fight each other with wooden or blunt weapons, their inevitable failure part of the script. It was never meant to be a contest. It was a demonstration. Rebellion against Rome ended not just in death, but in the most humiliating erasure possible. The layering of violence with humiliation was deliberate. To kill was simple. To destroy dignity was divine. Women already considered property became public sacrifices. Exposure in the arena inverted Roman ideals of female modesty. A society obsessed with veils, with the sanctity of the matron's body, stripped enslaved women naked before tens of thousands. This was not only punishment, It was inversion turning their bodies into signs of disorder so that the restoration of order, their deaths could feel cathartic to the crowd. Roman historians wrote about these executions with a chilling detachment. Cassius Dio Suetonius and Tacitus mention such spectacles not as aberrations, but as evidence of imperial authority. The law codified the process. The condemned were sentenced, transported, and executed according to rules that blurred judiciary and theatre. An enslaved woman did not stand trial as a person. She was processed as a body, and her destruction became part of civic ritual. Archaeology adds its silent testimony. Inscriptions in amphitheatres record expenditures for exotic beasts and elaborate machinery. Relief carvings show bound figures, their arms outstretched as animals leap. Charred remains found in execution pits confirm that fire was a common method. These fragments tell us that such punishments were not rumor or exaggeration, but routine. For the women, the terror was unimaginable. Stripped before the crowd, she knew her death was not for herself, but for others to warn her enslaved sisters, to reassure her masters, to entertain her captors. The audience's pleasure magnified her suffering. Every scream became both warning and applause. Her individuality dissolved, replaced by a role in Rome's cruel theatre rebel beast fodder, mythic victim, disposable body. And yet even in these moments, resistance lingered. Some accounts hint at defiance. Women spitting at their guards, cursing masters, refusing to beg for mercy. In these acts, however small, lay an assertion that they were more than the roles forced upon them. The arena designed to obliterate identity sometimes preserved it through the memory of defiance. But for Rome, the lesson was clear. Freedom was not only denied, but punished with spectacle. To run was to risk not just death, but transformation into entertainment. Every enslaved woman who watched, whether from the stands or later, through rumor absorbed the message the master's power extended beyond the household, into the public heart of the empire itself. The arena was not merely a place of sport, it was the empire's loudest declaration that resistance would be met with blood and humiliation. The amphitheatre was not simply a stage of punishment. It was the empire's mirror, where cruelty became communal joy. When enslaved women were condemned to death for flight, their bodies were transformed into entertainment, their suffering rewritten as civic ritual. Rome prided itself on law, order, and rationality, yet, in the arena, it dissolved into a frenzy of appetite. Thousands of citizens, from senators to commoners, united in watching a woman torn apart or burned alive. This is the paradox. Punishment was meant to deter, but its packaging as spectacle converted discipline into delight. The execution of a fugitiva was not hidden away in a prison cell. It was flaunted beneath the sun, framed by architecture meant to glorify empire. The Colosseum alone could seat upwards of 50,000. Imagine the roar of that crowd when a gate opened and a woman stumbled into the sand, her chains clinking, her eyes wide with terror. Her death was already determined, but the journey toward it, her screams, her resistance, her collapse, was consumed like theatre. The appetite for blood was cultivated deliberately. Emperors knew the political value of games. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was the formula. Juvenal mocked, but it held true. Feed the people, entertain them, and their anger at corruption, taxes, or famine would dissipate. In this economy of distraction, enslaved bodies became currency. For every fugitive woman thrown to lions, the empire bought another day of public calm, another chorus of cheers instead of revolt. The moral implications are staggering. To a Roman audience, the enslaved woman was not just a criminal. She was a spectacle licensed by law. Her death did not stain the state, it sanctified it. By watching her body consumed, Romans reassured themselves that order had triumphed, that boundaries had been enforced. Violence was not disorder, but the proof of order. Even children watched. Accounts describe families attending executions as if they were parades, vendors selling food and trinkets in the stands, while a human life unraveled below. Laughter mingled with screams. These shared experiences hardened Roman sensibilities, embedding cruelty into the cultural fabric. A child who clapped as a lion mauled a runaway would grow into an adult who saw violence not as tragedy but as justice. For women, the humiliation was doubled. Rome's moralists exalted the matron who embodied pudicitia, modesty, chastity, dignity, yet enslaved women were stripped naked in public, turned into the very image of dishonor. Their deaths mocked the values freeborn women were told to uphold. A free matron's purity was reinforced by the slave's degradation, as if Rome could only elevate one by annihilating the other. This system of entertainment through punishment erased individuality. The condemned woman was not remembered by name. Her story ended the moment the crowd dispersed. No epitaph, no record, only the fading thrill of her death. Roman writers seldom described these women as human beings with histories. Instead, they appear in sources as a slave, a criminal, a body. Their silence in the historical record is itself a testimony to the efficiency of Rome's erasure. Yet, for all its brutality, this ritual revealed the fragility of Roman authority. Why else the need for such public cruelty, if not to constantly remind citizens and slaves alike that the system was unshakable? A confident empire does not parade its captives to prove its strength. Rome, despite its marble, and legions betrayed its fear of rebellion in every staged execution. The bodies of fugitive women became the stage props of that insecurity. And still, one wonders what passed through the minds of the condemned. Did they regret the attempt at freedom? Or did they hold fast to the memory of their brief defiance, even as death closed in? Perhaps in those last moments, some found a twisted victory. They had unsettled Rome enough to become spectacle, a disruption that demanded the whole city's attention. Even in erasure, they forced recognition. Thus, the arena was both theatre and grave. It offered Rome entertainment, but left no space for the enslaved to speak their own story. Their voices vanished in the roar of the crowd, their dignity dissolved into performance. And yet beneath the spectacle's noise, the silence of their humanity lingers, accusing us across centuries. Rome thought it had erased them. In truth, it revealed itself an empire that transformed women's suffering into applause, calling cruelty justice and death entertainment. If branding and the arena carved punishment into the flesh of fugitivi with fire and beasts, the whip was the empire's daily instrument of domination. To enslaved women who dared to flee the lash was not just a punishment, it was a language of ownership. Its crack across the skin declared again and again, you are property, and your body is the parchment on which Rome writes its law. The whip most often used was the flagrum or flagellum, a brutal device made of multiple leather thongs, sometimes weighted with fragments of bone lead or bronze. Unlike a simple switch or rod, this whip was designed to tear. Each strike could lacerate the skin, raising welts that quickly split open, leaving long ribbons of blood. Some instruments were more sadistic, still barbed ends that caught flesh and ripped it loose, or weighted knots that bruised muscle and bone. The Romans were methodical in their cruelty, inventing tools not to kill swiftly, but to prolong agony and mark obedience. For enslaved women accused of escape, the scourging could occur in different contexts. Sometimes it was inflicted privately in the domus, a calculated ritual where other slaves were forced to watch their silence, punctuated by the sound of leather against flesh. At other times, the punishment was made public, in the courtyard of the house in the marketplace, or even at the city gates, where passers-by could witness the lesson. The message was consistent. Disobedience was not just a personal failing. It was an attack on Roman order. And order demanded blood. What made the whip especially terrifying was the lack of limits. Roman law set no cap on lashes for enslaved people. Unlike citizens who had some protections against excessive corporal punishment, the enslaved had none. A master could order 10 lashes, 50, 100 or more. The number was determined not by law, but by anger, humiliation, or the desire to make an example. For a woman whose attempted flight had embarrassed her master, the beating could stretch until exhaustion overcame both victim and executioner. The whip was also a tool of degradation. It was not only about inflicting pain, but about stripping away the last semblance of dignity. Enslaved women might be flogged while partially unclothed, their bodies exposed to the gaze of others. In a culture where female modesty was fiercely policed, this exposure was a form of violence in itself. Roman society prized the chastity of freeborn matrons, yet it sanctioned the humiliation of enslaved women as spectacle. Their suffering reaffirmed the hierarchy, one woman's body degraded to reinforce another's purity. Literary sources reveal how normalized this cruelty was. Roman satire often mentions beatings as if they were routine jokes. Writers like Juvenal and Petronius toss off references to slaves being whipped not as tragedies, but as background noise to daily life. This casualness tells us something chilling. The lash was so ingrained into Roman society that it became invisible. Pain was not exceptional. It was ordinary, woven into the rhythm of empire. For enslaved women, the whip carried psychological as well as physical weight. The scars on their backs and shoulders were permanent reminders of failed defiance. Even if the skin healed, the memory of the lash endured, the anticipation of its crack, the helplessness of being restrained, the laughter or silence of witnesses. This was punishment, as terror, ensuring that even the thought of escape carried the shadow of pain. Yet, paradoxically, the whip could not always achieve what it intended. Some women, even after brutal lashings, attempted escape again. The flagellum could scar the body, but it could not extinguish the ember of freedom. Roman jurists knew this. Their legal codes often mention repeat fugitives' proof that pain alone could not erase the human will to resist. Still, the lash was applied endlessly, as though repetition might succeed where single cruelty had failed. Whipping also served as a prelude to further punishments. A branded face might follow a bloodied back. A condemned woman might first be scourged before being sent to the arena or the mines. In this way, the lash was both punishment and preparation, a staging ground for more elaborate forms of violence. The image of a woman bent beneath the whip captures the essence of Roman slavery: total domination enforced through the body. It is here in the sting of leather weighted with bone that Rome's contradictions become stark. This was the same society that praised Stoic philosophers for preaching self-control, yet it exalted masters who could not control their rage. This was the empire that celebrated law, yet it allowed a man's fury to dictate whether a woman lived or died beneath the scourge. The whip was not just a tool. It was an emblem of Rome's power, flexible, versatile, and devastating. And in every lash, it carved the empire's authority into human flesh line by line until even the body itself bore testimony to Rome's cruelty. In Rome, the lash did more than break skin. It declared the enslaved body to be a legal object. Pain was not simply punishment, it was a contract enforced with blood. For enslaved women who attempted escape, the whip became a courtroom, and their bodies the parchment upon which judgment was inscribed. Roman law codified this with chilling precision. The Digest and other legal compilations treated slaves not as persons, but as res, things that could be owned, sold, and destroyed. When an enslaved woman fled, her master had not lost a companion, but property that had dared to contradict possession. Punishment, therefore, was framed as restoration. To whip her was to mend the broken contract, to reassert ownership through the medium of pain. There was no tribunal to intervene, no magistrate to weigh proportionality. The law gave masters absolute power, the infamous ius vitae necisc, the right of life and death. Escape was categorized as defiance, but more importantly, as damage. Not damage to the woman's body. Her body did not legally belong to her, but damage to the master's authority, reputation, and finances. A woman who ran risked depriving her master of labor, humiliating him in the eyes of neighbors, and undermining the obedience of other slaves. The whip therefore functioned as both penalty and property insurance. Whipping in private within the confines of the domus was a way to discipline quietly a correction carried out under household control. But whipping in public had an entirely different function. When an enslaved woman was scourged in the marketplace, at the villa's gates, or in the fields, her suffering became a communal reminder. The master was not just restoring order in his own household, but reinforcing the architecture of Roman slavery itself. The legal culture of Rome fused spectacle with discipline. Unlike the branding iron, which left a visible mark of fugitiva, the whip left patterns of scars that could be read as both punishment and ownership. In a society obsessed with reputation and honor, those scars functioned like inscriptions, proof of discipline applied. They were in effect a master's claim signed into human flesh. The instruments themselves symbolized this legal philosophy. The flagrum, with its metal and bone weights, was not a random device, it was a property law made tangible. Each lash was a clause, each strike an article reaffirming the enslaver's right. Roman satirists might make jokes about slaves tasting the whip, but the reality was more bureaucratic than comic. The lash was an administrative tool, a daily reinforcement of legal order through violence. What is striking is the absence of protection. For free citizens, there were limits to flogging appeals could be made, and the magistrates might intervene. For enslaved women, there was no such barrier. The law not only permitted, but expected masters to enforce discipline with violence. A master who did not punish was seen as weak, failing in his role as paterfamilias. Thus, cruelty was reframed as duty and neglect of cruelty as negligence. The humiliation was compounded by gender. In a culture that valued female modesty, the act of stripping or exposing a woman for public whipping carried additional violence. Her body, already denied autonomy, was transformed into a legal notice board, her shame doubling as her master's triumph. Roman society built its hierarchies not just on chains, but on spectacles of degradation carefully calibrated to reinforce both patriarchy and slavery. Literary echoes confirm this logic. Petronius Juvenal and Martial describe lashings with a tone that blends casualness with cruelty, treating them as normal episodes of daily life. In these texts, the whip becomes shorthand for authority, as routine as locking a door or balancing accounts. The absence of outrage in these references shows how deeply normalized the equation of pain with law had become. Even more chilling is how whipping could precede further punishments. The lash softened the body for branding, prepared the condemned for the arena, or humiliated the woman before sending her to the mines. In every case, it re-established the master's property rights, first making subsequent punishments feel like extensions of the same logic. It was a legal punctuation mark, a reminder that no matter what followed, the enslaved body had already been written into submission. To the Romans, the whip was never just leather and knots. It was jurisprudence in motion. It announced to the enslaved community that pain was the binding language of law, and to the master's peers that his property was firmly under control. It fused legality with spectacle, cruelty with duty, until there was no distinction. In this way, whipping became Rome's most eloquent declaration of power. A woman's scream was not her own. It was the voice of Roman law echoing across stone courtyards and crowded marketplaces. And in every lash, the empire reminded itself that its greatness rested not only on marble and law codes, but on the backs of those who were forced to carry their scars as proof of ownership. If branding disfigured, if whipping humiliated, if the arena killed in a blaze of spectacle, the mines devoured in silence. For enslaved women who attempted escape and were sentenced to damnatio in metallum condemnation to the mines, the punishment was not just severe. It was a living death stretched out across weeks, months, or perhaps years, if their bodies could endure. The mines of the Roman world were scattered across the empire. The gold veins of Dacia, the iron-rich hills of Noricum, the silver pits of Spain, and the copper and lead deposits of Sardinia. Each was both a source of imperial wealth and a graveyard for countless enslaved lives. Unlike the amphitheater, where punishment was a spectacle before thousands, the mines erased their victims from view. Women disappeared into shafts where sunlight never reached, where air was thick with dust, and the smell of sweat, stone, and decay. The environment was hostile from the start. Underground galleries were cut narrow to follow veins of ore, often so tight that workers crawled on hands and knees, dragging baskets of rubble behind them. Ventilation was poor, leaving toxic fumes from smelting fires to collect in suffocating pockets. Collapses were frequent, entombing the living alongside the already dead. For women, the hardships were doubled by vulnerability to guards and overseers who wielded unchecked authority. Inscriptions and legal fragments show that sexual exploitation in mines was rampant with no sanctuary, even in the darkness of the shafts. Pregnancy did not spare them. Accounts from early Christian writers, horrified by what they witnessed, describe women laboring underground, while pregnant, sometimes giving birth in the very tunnels they worked. Infants born in these conditions rarely survived, and when they did, they entered the same bondage as their mothers. To bring life into the mines was to condemn it from the first breath. The work itself was brutal. Women hauled ore in wicker baskets, crushed stone with hammers, and cleared debris with crude picks. Fingers blistered and split lungs filled with fine particles of lead and mercury. Malnutrition was the rule, not the exception. Rations were meager: barley gruel, stale bread, sometimes diluted wine to dull exhaustion. The body weakened quickly, and those who slowed down were beaten or chained in place until they moved again or died. Ancient authors rarely lingered on the fate of women in the mines, but archaeology speaks more directly. At Rio Tinto in Spain, skeletons show signs of extreme malnutrition, repetitive stress injuries, and exposure to toxic metals. Jawbones reveal teeth ground down by grit in the food and constant inhalation of stone dust. Vertebrae fused from years of carrying loads too heavy for human frames. Many remains belong to young people, teenagers, even children, suggesting that enslaved women sent to the mines often brought with them daughters and sons, condemned together to the empire's hunger for metal. What makes this punishment especially haunting is its invisibility. Public lashings and arena executions announced their message loudly. Rome is in control, but the mines whispered their terror back into enslaved households in a different way. When a woman disappeared into the earth, never to return. Her absence spoke louder than her screams could. Other slaves saw the chains carried away, heard whispers of Noricum or Dalcia, and knew what it meant. The mines were a black hole. No appeal, no witness, no afterlife of memory except fear. The slow execution carried a logic. Rome had little use for fugitives who defied authority, but it still had use for their bodies. Every ounce of gold extracted, every bar of lead smelted, was another contribution to the state that had condemned them. The mines transformed rebellion into wealth. Even in punishment, enslaved women's labor was harvested until their last breath. Death, when it came, was not marked by applause or ritual, but by silence. A collapse in the dark, a body left where it fell, covered by rubble and dust. To be condemned to the mines was to be erased twice once. From the living city above and again by the earth itself. No monument bore their names, no poem mourned their suffering. Only the empire's wealth, gleaming in coins and ingots, bore the hidden trace of their toil and their death. Rome's grandeur stamped into every denarius carried with it the invisible epitaph of women who had once dared to flee. Why did Rome choose the mines for fugitivae, when public punishments like branding or the arena seemed more effective as deterrents? The answer lies in a grim paradox. Invisibility could sometimes be louder than spectacle. The mines devoured bodies out of sight, but their absence became a haunting lesson in every enslaved household. A woman taken away to Noricum or Sardinia did not return, did not send word, did not even have a grave. She simply vanished into the earth. And that void, more than screams or blood, was enough to freeze rebellion in the minds of others. The Romans understood power as both a theatre and an architecture. In the theatre of punishment, the arena, the gate, the public square, terror was direct and immediate. But the mines functioned as architecture, silent, permanent, and unspoken rule carved into the stone of daily life. If one dared to run, the mines waited. And their terror seeped into households like a chill, whispered in courtyards, invoked by overseers who needed no whip at hand. The invisibility was deliberate. Rome was a society obsessed with spectacle, yet it carefully concealed certain forms of cruelty. Public punishments were for disorderly slaves who could be turned into examples. spectacles to reassure the free citizens that order reigned. But the mines were for those who had transgressed in ways too threatening to be staged. Repeated escape was not just disobedience, it was defiance of Rome's entire system of domination. To parade such women in the arena too often risked inspiring sympathy or even admiration. Better to erase them, burying them in shafts where their deaths profited the empire and left no body to mourn. This erasure was reinforced by law. The sentence of damnatio in Metallum was not technically a death penalty, yet everyone knew it was one. Roman jurists described it with chilling matter-of-factness. Slaves who proved incorrigible were to be sent to the mines for the rest of their days. No term limit, no chance of manumission. The punishment was legal exile into a slow death, coded into the bureaucracy of empire. The mines thus became an extension of property law. An enslaved woman's body was not destroyed outright, but consumed until nothing remained useful. But invisibility had its own form of spectacle. Every time a fugitive disappeared, those left behind filled in the blanks with imagination. Whispers spread about women collapsing under falling rock, about infants born into chains, about overseers who used their authority to violate without restraint. The absence itself became a story retold in kitchens, fields, and workshops. Unlike a public whipping that faded with the bruises, the mines produced a lingering ghost story, a reminder that Rome's punishments did not end at the lash or the iron. Even free citizens sensed the mine's reputation. Roman authors like Pliny the Elder described the mines of Spain with horror labyrinthine passages suffocating dust workers who wasted away to shadows. If freeborn writers recoiled at the conditions of wage labourers, one can imagine how enslaved women fared under harsher discipline. Fewer rations and no protections. The mines became synonymous with despair, a punishment feared even by criminals and rebels. In this way, the mines embodied Rome's genius for domination. The arena shouted, the lash cracked, but the mines whispered a whisper that spread faster than screams because it was carried in absence. The empty place at the hearth where a woman had sat, the silence in the fields where her voice once sang, the sudden disappearance of a mother, a sister, a daughter, all of it reinforced a lesson without needing spectacle. Rome turned silence into a weapon. And so damnatio in Metallum was both execution and deterrence. The woman condemned vanished from the city, erased from public view, but her memory returned as a shadow in every slave's imagination. Her invisible death ensured a visible terror that lingered in those still alive. A reminder that in Rome, even punishment could be mined for profit and fear alike. In Rome, punishment was never just about pain. It was about message. And for enslaved women, that message was sharpened by the culture's obsession with modesty, appearance, and honor. Roman society prized the female body as both vessel of lineage and emblem of family reputation, which meant that any attack on a woman's body reverberated with symbolic violence. Branding, stripping, whipping, or exposure inflicted not only wounds, but also a lasting stigma. These punishments worked precisely because they targeted the very qualities Roman culture claimed to revere in women: chastity, modesty, dignity, and inverted them into tools of humiliation. The most immediate example was branding. For men, the hot iron might scar the shoulder, chest, or leg. For women, the forehead was chosen. The logic was cruelly calculated. A scar on the face destroyed not just anonymity, but beauty, the very currency of female worth in Roman eyes. In a culture where a woman's appearance could determine her fate, her marriageability, her honor, her usefulness, branding the forehead meant permanent degradation. She carried her crime not only in pain, but as a disfigurement visible to all, a scar that reclassified her from person to spectacle. Exposure carried a similar edge. When women were chained at the household gate, they were often displayed in partial undress, their garments torn or arranged to exaggerate their vulnerability. Roman comedy makes offhand jokes about slaves punished at doors, but for women this punishment meant being made into an object of voyeurism. Passers-by could leer. Masters could point to the body as evidence of their control. What was for men a punishment of confinement became for women a public stripping of dignity. Whipping too was transformed by gendered logic. A flogged man was shamed, yes, but still within the logic of discipline familiar to soldiers or criminals. A flogged woman, especially if stripped during the punishment, was doubly humiliated. The whip tore not only skin, but the veil of modesty, exposing her body to the gaze of household members or in public to strangers. Enslaved women thus endured a punishment that doubled as a sexualized spectacle, violence framed as correction but staged as degradation. Even death sentences carried gendered symbolism. In the arena, male criminals might be dressed as gladiators or mythological heroes. Women, by contrast, were often costumed as sacrificial maidens, witches, or lascivious figures from myth. Their punishments were theatrical inversions of proper femininity. Virgins, exposed mothers, stripped captives mocked as temptresses. These roles were carefully chosen to mock female honor before erasing it in blood. Roman moral philosophy only deepened these contradictions. The ideal matron was to be silent, veiled, modest, and obedient. Yet the punishments inflicted on enslaved women thrust them into the public gaze, stripped them bare, and forced them into roles of maximum exposure. In other words, Rome's punishments deliberately inverted its ideals, turning modesty into humiliation. This inversion was part of the deterrent by showing that disobedience could erase not only life, but dignity. The system terrorized others into compliance. Elite Romans understood this perfectly. Writers from Juvenal to Martial mocked women's fallenness as though shame was a natural consequence rather than a calculated weapon. Satire portrayed branded or flogged women as comic figures, their pain turned into entertainment. But behind the laughter lay a social truth. Punishment functioned by attacking what culture claimed to value most, turning the supposed virtues of femininity into instruments of control. The cruelty was not random. Rome was a society that performed hierarchy at every level, through dress codes, seating orders, public rituals. Punishments for women simply extended that performance into the realm of the body. To whip brand chain or strip a woman was to inscribe her defiance into flesh, to mark her visibly as degraded, and to remind every observer of what happened when the rules were broken. In this way, Roman punishments weaponized gender itself. They made the female body into both target and message, ensuring that shame cut deeper than any lash. The scars were not only physical, but cultural reminders that in Rome to be an enslaved woman was to live in a system where even one's dignity was property to be stripped away at will. If Roman punishments for enslaved women were cruel, their normalization in literature was perhaps more chilling. Comedy, satire, and casual anecdotes reveal how deeply these practices were embedded in the cultural imagination. To read Plautus Juvenal or Petronius, is to encounter a world where violence against enslaved people, especially women, was not exceptional, but every day woven into joke stories and observations that entertained audiences while reflecting the brutal mechanics of Roman life. Plautus, writing comedies in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, offers some of the earliest glimpses. His plays, often performed for mixed audiences, include casual references to slaves being chained at doors or whipped for disobedience. Laughter in this context was a cultural anesthetic. The reality iron cutting into flesh, women exposed to the street, was transformed into farce. To Romans in the audience, the gag worked precisely because they recognized the practice. What for us is grotesque was, for them, familiar. By the 1st century CE, Juvenal's satires sharpened this cruelty into moral outrage, though never on behalf of the enslaved women themselves. Juvenal mocked Rome's elites for their indulgences, sneering at the cost of delicately kept boys or the humiliation of wives. But when he mentioned whippings, brandings, or the spectacle of punished slaves, it was rarely to condemn the violence. Instead, these images served as rhetorical ammunition, proof of decadent symbols of disorder, but never an argument for the humanity of the enslaved. The enslaved woman remained a backdrop, her suffering repurposed as metaphor. Petronius in the Satyricon presented a similar paradox. His grotesque banquet scenes satirize elite excess, and in the margins of these spectacles are enslaved figures flogged, mocked, forced into humiliating service. Again, the joke was not their pain, but the absurdity of their masters. Yet by reducing the enslaved to props in elite satire, the literature reinforced their invisibility. They existed only to show the moral failings of others, never as subjects of their own stories. This casualness is revealing. When branding or chaining at the gate appears in Roman comedy, it is not presented as shocking. It is familiar stage business shorthand for discipline. Just as a modern sitcom might reference traffic jams or bad weather, Roman plays leaned on images of slave punishment as ordinary, unremarkable background. The humor worked because the audience recognized the reality. In this way, literature normalized violence by embedding it in laughter. Archaeology confirms the practices the plays treated as jokes. Excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum have uncovered shackles fixed near entrances of houses, suggesting spaces where enslaved people might have been chained as warnings. Iron collars have been found inscribed with messages such as, "Hold me," lest I flee, tangible evidence of fugitivae, reduced to living signposts. Whips weighted with bone or lead, recovered from Roman sites, speak of instruments designed not just to sting, but to tear flesh. These objects, stripped of literary irony, testify to the suffering beneath the satire. The gap between literature and archaeology highlights how normalized cruelty had become. The satirists used pain as metaphor. The playwrights turned it into punchline. But the ground still yields the iron and leather that cut into real bodies. The dissonance is telling Roman culture simultaneously joked about, critiqued, and practiced violence, never questioning its legitimacy. What is absent from both literature and archaeology are the voices of the women themselves. No fugitiva left her own testimony. No branded forehead spoke in the first person. What survives are the traces of their punishment and the laughter of others. The silence is as haunting as the artifacts. It forces us to reconstruct lives through fragments left by those who never saw enslaved women as fully human. The casual cruelty in satire, the corroborating evidence in ruins, and the absence of direct voices together form a triangle of erasure. Rome's culture did not just tolerate violence against enslaved women, it folded it into entertainment humor and daily ritual. This normalization ensured that even when the punishments were visible at the gate in the arena or inscribed in iron, they were stripped of moral weight. They became scenery, not scandal. And so when we laugh at Plautus's jokes or admire the elegance of Roman satire, we must ask, what laughter did it mask? What realities did it trivialize? The fragments remind us that humor too can be a tool of violence, one that renders suffering invisible by making it ordinary. The brutality inflicted on enslaved women in Rome was not an accident of circumstance, nor merely the sadism of individual masters. It was systematized, codified, and protected by law. Roman law did not see enslaved people as persons, but as property. And this legal framing meant that every punishment, branding, whipping, chaining, execution was not a violation, but an affirmation of the master's rights. The framework of jurisprudence itself became a weapon. The most striking example was the fugitiva laws. Roman jurists obsessed with order recognized the recurring problem of flight and set about regulating how slaves should be marked, punished, and recovered. Branding runaway women on the forehead with the letters FVG was not a choice. It was a legal expectation, a measure designed to make fugitives permanently recognizable. Inscriptions survive on iron collars declaring, "I am a slave. If you find me, return me to my master." These were not ad hoc devices, but legal instruments sanctioned by custom and court precedent. The Roman household domus was itself a legal universe, with the master, the paterfamilias, wielding ius vitae necisque, the right of life and death over those within it. For enslaved women, this meant there was no appeal, no legal recourse, no higher protection. If branded, whipped, or raped, the law did not recognize them as victims. Their suffering could only be acknowledged as damage to another man's property. Even when masters killed their slaves outright, the law often looked away, unless the act threatened public order or provoked scandal. Cruelty was not regulated. It was normalized. Take the penalty of damnatio ad bestias. This was not just a theatrical excess, but a judicial sentence. Courts could condemn a repeat runaway woman to be torn apart by animals in the arena. The act was both punishment and entertainment, a legally sanctioned spectacle. The sentence of damnatio in metallum condemnation to the mines was likewise embedded in the law. This was not an informal exile, but a codified punishment, written into legal categories, designed to erase disobedient bodies in pits of lead and iron. Even when laws appeared to restrict cruelty, they were riddled with hypocrisy. The Lex Cornelia technically prohibited castration, a recognition of its severity. But enforcement was inconsistent, especially when elite households desired eunuchs or delicately groomed boys for service. The law that seemed to offer protection was itself circumvented by the powerful showing that legal strictures bent easily to social desires. What mattered was not the life of the enslaved, but the convenience of the master. The sexual vulnerability of enslaved women was another legal blind spot. Roman law did not criminalize the rape of slaves because, by definition, they had no capacity to consent. Assaulting an enslaved woman was not a crime against her, but at most an injury to her master's property rights, if she were harmed to the point of losing value. Thus, the law placed her body firmly in the realm of commodity. Any violation was at worst a financial loss to the owner. It is important to see how carefully this cruelty was structured. Roman law was not chaotic, it was deliberate. Branding was not just vengeance, it was record-keeping. Whipping was not just pain, it was discipline, inscribed on the body. The mines were not simply exile, they were a method of execution hidden from public view. Each punishment reinforced the legal fiction that enslaved women were not people, but tools, property, and warnings. Roman jurists even had terminology for slaves that reduced them to functions. They distinguished between instrumentum vocale, the speaking tool, instrumentum, semivocale, the half-speaking tool like animals, and instrumentum mutum mute tools like plows. The enslaved woman branded, whipped, chained, or cast to beasts fell into the first category, a speaking tool capable of language but denied the rights of humanity. By embedding cruelty into law, Rome gave violence the aura of legitimacy. Masters were not acting in excess, they were executing their rights. Courts were not indulging sadism, they were preserving order. What modern minds see as atrocity was to Romans a matter of statute and precedent. And so when we look back at Roman greatness, the aqueducts, the codices, the enduring shadow of Roman law, we must also see the scaffolding of cruelty that held it all together. Roman law gave the empire its spine. But for enslaved women, that spine was made of iron collars, searing brands, and the silent acceptance of their erasure. Against this immense machinery of law and cruelty, one might think enslaved women in Rome had no chance, no space to resist. And yet, history, fragmented though it is, offers glimpses of defiance, of survival strategies, and of memory, carried forward even in silence. Escape itself was an act of resistance. Every woman who tried to flee, knowing the lash, the iron, or the beasts awaited her, was declaring that even a slim chance of freedom was worth the certainty of pain. The brand of FVG seared into her forehead did not erase the fact that she had tried to run, that she had once chosen defiance over submission. Each branded face was also a testimony someone once believed in flight. Some women resisted in quieter ways, finding methods to endure and subvert within the confines of the household. Stories whispered among enslaved communities hint at solidarity networks, others providing food or covering for those in hiding, or simply carrying the memory of a punished woman forward. So, she was not erased entirely. When a woman was chained at the gate, she became a public warning. But she was also a beacon to others. Her suffering revealed the brutality of the system more than any law code could. There were repeated escape attempts. Roman legal records note, women and men labeled siepe fugitiva repeat runaways. To persist after the first punishment to risk the lash again was an extraordinary act of human will. The mines and the brands and the arena, none of it fully broke the instinct to flee. Archaeologists have found graffiti etched into walls by enslaved people, marks of presence that said, "I was here." These fragments, anonymous and defiant, challenged the silence Roman elites imposed. Resistance also took the form of memory itself. Though enslaved women left no writings of their own, their pain echoes in satire, in law codes, in the bitter jokes of playwrights. Even when meant to entertain free audiences, these casual references preserved evidence of cruelty. Later generations reading Plautus or Juvenal could glimpse the reality behind the laughter. The cruel humor unintentionally recorded the system's darkest truths. Religious rituals sometimes became a covert space for resistance. Scholars suggest that enslaved women participated in underground cults where whispered prayers were offered not to the Roman gods, but to deities of their homeland or to hybrid figures who embodied hope for liberation. In these hidden ceremonies, memory of freedom survived, smuggled in song and story. Even when chained in the mines, some women reportedly passed down names and tales, ensuring that their children, however doomed, would know they were more than Rome's property. There are accounts, fragmentary but evocative, of enslaved women joining larger revolts. Though most records focus on male leaders, like Spartacus, women were present among the rebels, carrying arms, caring for the wounded, or fighting outright. Every rebellion, no matter how brutally suppressed, kept alive the idea that slavery could be challenged. The Roman state feared not only individual escapes, but the contagion of collective defiance. That fear was why punishments were made so public, so spectacular, because resistance was always possible. Even death could be turned into an act of resistance. Women condemned to the beasts sometimes faced their fate with gestures of defiance, spitting at spectators or refusing to plead. Ancient writers conditioned by Roman contempt rarely interpreted this as courage. But read differently, it was a refusal to let Rome own their final moment. Some chose suicide over capture, slipping into rivers, leaping from cliffs, or finding poison, preferring self-determined death to life in chains. What survives then is not only cruelty, but the faint outline of resilience. Every attempt to flee, every scar that carried a story, every whispered memory passed through shackled lips was resistance. Rome tried to brand whip and bury these women into oblivion, but traces remain enough to remind us that even in systems designed for total domination, the human will to resist is never fully extinguished. The memory of their defiance lingers in the cracks of Roman history. It survives in the silence, in the absences, in the things Roman law tried not to see. And in our retelling centuries later, they resist again by refusing to be forgotten. The story of enslaved women who dared to flee and paid the price is not just a tale of Rome's cruelty, it is a mirror. Rome called itself Eternal Urbs Aeterna, the city of law and civilization. Yet its order was built on bodies turned into warnings, on women. Branded, chained, whipped, or fed to beasts so that others would learn obedience. The architecture of Roman greatness, its forums, its villas, its aqueducts, was inseparable from the spectacle of domination, from the daily reminders that freedom was not a universal right, but a privilege guarded by fear. The punishments inflicted on fugitive women were not random acts of cruelty. They were carefully staged performances designed to communicate power. The burn of the iron, the exposure at the gate, the roar of the arena, the hidden misery of the mines. All of these were part of Rome's choreography of control. Punishment was theatre, and the audience was not only the free citizens who laughed or shuddered, but also the enslaved communities who watched in terror and silence. Fear was the mortar that held the empire together. Rome's obsession with visibility, the mark on the forehead, the chained body at the threshold. The public lashings reminds us that power often thrives by making suffering visible in just the right way. Not hidden, not private, but staged, repeated, ritualized. Yet some punishments, like the mines, were deliberately concealed. Death underground carried no spectacle, but its shadow traveled back into the enslaved quarters, whispering that escape meant vanishing forever. Rome mastered both the visible terror of spectacle and the invisible terror of disappearance. the gendered dimension sharpened this cruelty. A man branded or whipped was humiliated, but a woman bore the added shame of her modesty, shattered. Rome knew that to strip dignity from women was to wound not just their bodies, but their identities. To brand a woman's face was to erase her femininity in a culture obsessed with honor and beauty. To expose her chained at a household entrance was to assault not only her freedom, but her very sense of personhood. And yet, when we step back, the echoes of this system feel disturbingly familiar. Societies today still criminalize those who flee, whether they are migrants crossing borders, laborers breaking contracts, or women escaping abusive systems. They are branded in different ways, through papers, through digital records, through stigma that clings as tightly as Rome's effigy. We still see bodies turned into deterrents, images of shackled migrants, prisoners in orange jumpsuits, paraded before cameras' headlines that make suffering into warning. The tools have changed, but the logic power maintained through fear remains. Rome teaches us an uncomfortable lesson. Greatness and cruelty can coexist. The same civilization that built aqueducts and codified law also normalized whipping women until they collapsed, chaining them as living decorations or feeding them to lions while crowds cheered. When we praise Rome's legacy without acknowledging this foundation, we risk repeating its blindness, admiring the marble while ignoring the mortar of human suffering. The echoes of power stretch across time. Every empire builds monuments, but also walls of silence around the people crushed to raise them. Rome's fugitivi remind us that civilization is not measured only by what it creates, but by what it destroys and who it chooses to erase. So, the final question remains: can power be just if it rests on spectacle and fear? Rome thought so. Perhaps we, standing centuries later, should answer differently. Because the brand of iron, the lash, the mines, the arena, they all whisper still. And what they whisper is this: the cost of greatness when built on suffering is a greatness already compromised.